Sara Flounders is the co-director of the International Action Center, an organization opposing U.S. militarism, corporate globalization, racism, and war. The IAC, initiated by former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, combines grassroots activism with protest activities. Since 1996, Sara has coordinated the Depleted Uranium Education Project to expose the impact of the use of radioactive depleted uranium weapons. The DU Education Project released a book that she edited, Medal of Dishonor, Depleted Uranium, which has been translated into Arabic, Japanese, Greek, and Italian. In 2006, she produced the documentary Poison Dust. She has a new book, War Without Victory, The Pentagon's Achilles Heel, which is scheduled to be released next month. She coordinated the International War Crimes Tribunal, which held hearings on U.S. war crimes in the Gulf in 30 U.S. cities and over 20 countries. She has organized opposition to U.S. military intervention in Bosnia, Panama, and Somalia. Sara Flounders, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Hello, good to be here speaking.
Hi there. You participated in war crimes tribunals relating to what I consider to be U.S. terrorism. I'm curious, has anything come out of those tribunals? I know that George W. Bush was convicted of war crimes in the World Court, but so many in both the Bush and Obama regimes have committed unconstitutional, meaning unlawful, acts of making war. Will we ever see justice for these crimes?
Well, it's important to keep demanding justice, accountability, and denouncing these wars as criminal at every level. That's true for the 1991 war against Iraq. It's true for the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. It's true for the continuing war in Afghanistan. It's true for U.S. policy today in Syria and last year in Libya. It's true for 1,000 U.S. military bases around the world. It's about Wall Street and corporate power, and it's not protection or defense of people here or anywhere in the world.
Well, these, you've actually sat in on these tribunals. Are they more than just politics as usual? I mean, I get your sincerity. I certainly am sincere about these issues. But when these bodies get together to discuss things like war crimes, does it turn into just plain politics as usual, or does stuff really get done there? Give us an insider's view.
Well, just to be clear on what the War Crimes Tribunal that we organized was. This was a grassroots effort. Thousands of people participated. There were hearings, as I say, in countries across the U.S., and cities across the U.S. and countries around the world. This is not the UN set up International Criminal Court, which really has only charged African countries with war crimes, never the U.S. The U.S. has refused to even sign on to the World Court or to abide by it. So there is criminal lawlessness on the part of our own government, and at the same time a willingness to charge any number of smaller, poorer countries around the world, countries far less developed, countries that have no capacity to really lay waste an entire country, which the Pentagon does have that capacity. So our efforts were really large educational efforts using both media, video, photos, a great deal of evidence from doctors, lawyers, scientists, and people on the ground as to what these wars did and in whose interests they were really fought. So it was an effort really at educating the public on the war that had just been fought and saying that new wars were to come.
Now, and your points are well taken. However, my experience is that any time you have these kinds of events, they are the equivalent of sowing seeds. You are planting seeds. Do any of those seeds take fruit? Have they seem to take root anywhere beyond just the grassroots efforts? Are there any countries out there that actually come forward, or any international courts or world courts to take a look at what goes on during these tribunals, these grassroots tribunals?
Well, I think very much so. I mean, you could even look at any of the polls in the U.S. Today among the average people, and again and again they'll tell you 60, 70, 75%, and sometimes higher oppose another U.S. war. Now, that's very interesting at the very time that the corporate media, the largest media, is selling war 24/7. They promote war, justify war endlessly, and justify a huge U.S. military presence around the world and a huge budget for it, which leads to all manner of cuts right here at home in both social programs, infrastructure, and things like that we really need. And so it's really up to us here to educate and challenge these wars, and we think it has an impact.
I'd like to start with the basics here. Up until maybe 15 years ago, I'd never even heard the term depleted uranium. What exactly is depleted uranium?
Well, let me explain both why it's so attractive to munitions makers. DU shells, depleted uranium shells, easily penetrate steel armor and burn on impact. It's very attractive to military contractors. It's so cheap it's actually offered free by the U.S. government. But the impact is the fire releases microscopic radioactive and toxic dust particles of uranium oxide. Now, that travels on the wind. It can be inhaled, ingested. It's contamination by seeping into the land and into the water. Now, just when it was used in the first Gulf War in 1991, more than half of the U.S. soldiers...
Sarah, before you get into the what, yeah. I want to describe what it actually is, what depleted uranium, because there are people out there who go, what is that, who really don't know what this substance is. And it's my understanding that depleted uranium is what we used to call U-238. We used to have uranium-235 and uranium-238. We never hear those terms anymore. But am I correct? Is depleted uranium effectively uranium-238?
Yes, exactly.
And that means it is radioactive. It's radioactive unto itself.
Yes, it's low level. It's considered low level radiation. The danger, the problem is low-level radiation, and it's also highly toxic in the same way that lead would be. Uranium is a toxic metal. And the combination of radioactive and toxic and very fine grains that lodge in internal organs means it really lowers the immune system. It causes genetic damage to the next generation. It causes extremely high rates of cancers. So the cancers, the birth defects, all of that is from what is, in military terms, an effective weapon, may be effective as a weapon, and yet, because it spreads, because this fine dust is so dangerous, that with anyone, you don't have to be a scientist to know, if half the soldiers from the first Gulf War are already well over half chronically ill. And when you look at the birth defects, take in Fallujah in Iraq, where there's been any number of international studies, and 15% of the children are born with serious birth defects.
Now,
14% of pregnancies and spontaneous abortions. I mean, the figures are absolutely stunning and terrifying. And we know from generations the impact of nuclear testing, radioactive weapons, the dumping of nuclear waste, the impact that had on indigenous people, on people in Japan from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the figures now are even higher because this is a fine dust.
Now, so hang on. I want to stay on what it is for a little while. We're going to have plenty of time to go into these statistics and such, because by the time we get to that, I want people to understand what a horror this metal is. Now, you say it's low-level radioactivity.
Right.
I'm not quite sure what high-level would be. But radioactive material is generally measured based upon what's called a half-life. If something is 100% radioactive, and it has a half-life of 1,000 years, then in 1,000 years, it's 50% radioactive. And 1,000 years after that, it's 25% radioactive. What is the half-life of depleted uranium?
Well, they say it's about the life of the sun. So that's just this problem isn't going away.
It's like 4 billion years.
Yes, exactly.
So in 4 billion years, it's 50% as bad as it is now. Oh, that's good to know.
Exactly. And for the listeners, the idea of this in any way being inconsequential, because that's what we're told. This isn't important. This isn't essential. This isn't even important for you to know. This is. They can talk about, they'll talk about nuclear testing and plutonium and all of that, but here's a fine dust that comes from using the heavy metal that's left after the uranium is extracted, the most radioactive. And so there's large quantities of U-238 lying around, and people don't think of it as dangerous. But it's actually extremely dangerous. It's the 235 and the 233 are what's used in the development of nuclear weapons. So I really think it's important to focus on what happens when you have shells, when you have armor that is used in conventional battles, when you have soldiers who are handling this and who are enveloped in this dust, and when you have civilian populations that are living in.
Aren't they using this to make vehicles and buildings and such? They're not just using it for weapons. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. It's been used incredibly and increasingly widely. And because it's an effective weapon, the impact on it is completely covered up.
Now, where?
And so tons of this material. We're talking about, at minimum, they're saying, the first Gulf War, 350 tons of DU material were used. But it's used in every war. It's used in Afghanistan.
Well, that's what I'm asking. We know about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I believe it was used in Bosnia. Was it used in Bosnia? I think Somalia.
Yes, and it was used pretty, right, in Serbia and Kosovo, and in every place where there are U.S. weapons, these are also stored and handled and used on proving grounds. So you have a material which is maybe the best example of the callousness of the way in which the Pentagon functions today, with no care or thought either for the lives of the surrounding civilians, the civilians who were targeted, the soldiers who were doing the fighting. And then afterwards, there's a big cover-up for the children of the soldiers, children of the civilians, the high cancer rates just disregarded, told them that has no connection to anything. And unless there's a much larger educational campaign about this, people don't know what is the cause of the cancers, of the birth defects, and of a whole series of other chronic health problems that flow from this.
Well, what
from participation in war areas.
What about U.S. military? I mean, if it's being used in bases and such, you have to assume U.S. military are being affected. Aren't they saying anything? I mean, aren't there members of the military who are speaking out on this issue?
Precious little. Really, there was the American Gulf War Veterans Association who reported that 30% of soldiers from the first Gulf War were chronically ill and receiving disability benefits. But all of this, it was called Gulf War syndrome, as if it was a big mystery. Didn't know exactly what caused it. Had a short moment in media, and then it just ebbed back as a non-issue. With the second Gulf War, it was absolutely a refusal to even deal with this. So you have background radiation that's 1,000 times, 1,900 times on all different measurements what it is normally. This is what people are living in and breathing. And we need to know about it and demand cleanup, demand an end to the use of these weapons. And there has been no such thing happening at all.
Now, is the U.S. the only country that is using DU, or are there other countries, generally once a technology is used, however poorly, the others pick up on it? Are there other countries also using depleted uranium in this way?
Well, the widest usage has been through the U.S. commanded and U.S. equipped NATO alliance. But any number of countries now use the material because it makes harder armor and such, and that's a danger in itself.
The reason I asked that...
The most extensive use has been by U.S. and NATO forces. There's been extensive coverage in Europe on this, and a demand that these weapons not be stored in Europe.
Okay, because that's the reason I asked, is that if other countries are using it, doesn't that set the stage for international attention on the issue? It's not just a U.S. issue. And are there any efforts out there from either government or non-government organizations such as the UN to address depleted uranium? From what I understand, Iraq has effectively been destroyed for the rest of all of our lifetimes and more.
Yeah, it's really, here's the cradle of civilization, the oldest inhabitable area, one of the oldest on the globe, and once a food exporter. Today, by massive destruction on all kinds of levels, importing 90% of its food. And as I say, these measurements of 15% children born with serious birth defects, it's not just the land, it's not just the water, it's actually genetic damage on a huge scale. There's silence at the UN on this, and I think we can only acknowledge that that's the overwhelming influence of the U.S. government in the United Nations. That what reports are issued and so on, it barely happens. The World Health Organization was going to issue a report on depleted uranium. At the last minute, it was suppressed. So there was an International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health who issued a report in the December 2010, so about a year and a half ago. They're based in Basel, Switzerland, and they're the ones who reported the enormously high rates of birth defects, spontaneous abortion, premature births, and very high rates of cancer. So there are research institutes who are studying this. But for the most part, in terms of all that could be done and should be done, there's silence. That's what we have to break through. We have to explain what the weapons are and especially what they're doing.
And the way you describe it, it seems like an insurmountable task. How do we overcome that level of suppression? In effect, you're talking about poisoning large tracts of the world. How do we go after the poisoners? Well,
I think we could look at past campaigns against nuclear testing in the atmosphere. At one point, the U.S. led the world in that and poisoned whole parts of the South Pacific and the Southwest of the U.S. There were big international and certainly here in the U.S. campaigns to stop that. Agent Orange, which was used so widely in Vietnam, and you have a whole generation of U.S. soldiers and especially of Vietnamese who had to continue to live in this contaminated land where these chemical herbicides were used that had disastrous impacts on the health. And there was a whole campaign against the use of Agent Orange and a whole number of herbicides, and they were finally pulled. So I think the more that there are active, forceful educational efforts such as this program where we're speaking right now, there was a long campaign to ban the use of depleted uranium weapons. So the activity goes up and down. When the film Poison Dust was made, and a lot of this material is on our website, the publishing of a book, and so on. The continuing to issue these reports. I think we can either be demoralized and overwhelmed by this, or we can say, no, we're going to do everything we can with the resources we have to demand an accounting and to demand they stop using these weapons and others that are far more dangerous. I mean, there are all kinds of weapons in the U.S. arsenal today that are enormously threatening for the planet as a whole. And the wars have catastrophic impact, but the weapons they use also do.
Is there anything at all that can be done to treat victims of DU poisoning? I mean, you talk about, genetic mutations, and it sounds like there's not a whole lot we can do once they've been exposed. Is there anything at all that can be done to either protect people from these effects or reverse them once they've been affected?
Well, I think like with any attack on the immune system, there are things that sometimes can be done to strengthen the immune system if people are seriously and chronically ill. I don't want to be totally pessimistic on it. I'm certainly hopeful that if science focused their energy instead of on developing new weapons, on developing cures to the diseases and sicknesses, right now, of course, a lot more could be done. And as they found in the cleanup of Agent Orange in Vietnam, that country left totally destroyed, and it was on them to clean up what had been dumped upon them. Sometimes from the very countries that are impacted, they find ways to begin to deal with this horror that has been imposed on them. I think we can't be completely pessimistic, or we write off whole populations. There are earlier times when lead was used and mercury was used, especially as people became aware of the impact, demanded that it be stopped. That in itself is important. But we have to recognize that our government today is interested, the corporations that have the greatest power, in where's the greatest profit. What weapons are the most profitable?
Oh, yeah.
Not the long-term feasibility of life. They are interested in selling weapons, and it's the number one U.S. export today.
Yeah, and
it's the largest military machine in the world.
War is historically, makes big money for the bankers and for, war is big profits. And as long as societies are driven by money, as long as that's the value that is placed above all others, there's going to be a lot of war. We got to get people to change the way they think, the values that they live by. You have a new book coming out, War Without Victory, the Pentagon's Achilles Heel. Just from the title, I got to know, what is the Pentagon's Achilles Heel?
Well, it's this, they can destroy whole parts of the world, and they have, and yet it does not come back here to change their position in the world. On every level, educational, healthcare, infrastructure right here, this is an empire, and it is an empire, in serious decline and decay. And the guaranteed profits of military contracts and conquests around the world doesn't resolve the fundamental problems. So that's what really I'm trying to point out when I say the wars are unwinnable. They're not a victory. They may be very powerful, but their weakness is it's not changing their situation in the world. And instead, these wars make us all poorer. in every level. And I don't mean only here in the U.S., but certainly the next generation and the generation after pays for these wars. Pays for these wars in the environmental impact, but they also pay in this endless, more than half the federal budget and discretionary spending and all that goes to militarism. Doesn't go to the things we need right here. And so it means we have the lowest educational level and health level of any of the industrialized countries. So what's really being won?
Yeah.
There is, it's really a danger for us, and it's important that people understand it, that these wars are a danger. Great victory.
All right.
Even though they're sold that way.
Sarah, I got to stop you there, but it's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay.
My guest has been Sara Flounders, co-director of the International Action Center. www.iacenter.org. iacenter.org. Get your own copy of Medal of Dishonor and view Poison Dust. And then don't forget to pick up War Without Victory, the Pentagon's Achilles heel. Thanks so much, Sarah. Please keep it up because it's very important what you're doing.
Thank you.